June 21, 1966. Several months before the 1966 Australian election, as the war in Vietnam rages overseas, federal opposition leader Arthur Calwell leaves the Mosman Town Hall in Sydney, having just addressed an anti-conscription rally. Peter Kocan, a 19-year-old labourer and factory worker, waits in the hall's lobby, watching as Calwell and his entourage exit the building. Concealed under Kocan's overcoat is a sawn-off .22 caliber rifle. Calwell gets into the passenger seat of the waiting Commonwealth car. Kocan approaches the vehicle, draws his weapon, and fires. Political assassinations, both successful and unsuccessful, are thankfully rare occasions in Australia. Historians generally consider the first such event to be Henry James O'Farrell's failed attempt on the life of Prince Albert, Duke of Edinburgh and the second son of Queen Victoria, in March 1868. 53 years later, Percy Brookfield, the state Labour MP for Sturt, was shot to death by Russian immigrant Kurman Tomoyov at a railway station in the South Australian town of Riverton in 1921, and while it was never proven, the notorious state and federal MP Thomas Leigh, who was later convicted of murder in England, is alleged to have been responsible for the deaths of several of his political rivals through the 1920s. The Australian federal election of 1966 took place against the backdrop of the Vietnam War. The Liberal country government had steadily increased Australia's military involvement over the past 4 years and had now introduced a military draft. Australia's participation in the conflict remained broadly popular, but the anti-war movement was becoming increasingly vocal. One of the most prominent critics was Arthur Calwell, a fierce opponent of the war and of military conscription. Calwell had been leader of the Federal Labour Party and of the opposition since 1960. He was narrowly defeated by then Prime Minister Robert Menzies in 1961, and then by a significantly wider margin in their rematch in 1963, and by 1966 was leading his party to a third attempt at taking office, this time against Menzies' successor as Prime Minister, Harold Holt. On the 21st of June that year, he travelled to the Mosman Town Hall in Sydney's northeastern suburbs for one of many rallies against conscription. It was there that he found himself in the sights of Peter Kocan. Kocan was born Peter Raymond Douglas on the 4th of May 1947 in Newcastle, New South Wales, just 3 months after his father's death in a car accident. When he was 7, his mother remarried to Ludovic Kocan. Her new husband was abusive and emotionally distant. According to Kocan, "My stepfather used to go off for long periods to work and then suddenly reappear, and then the fights would start. At the time I saw him as the absolute villain, but now I suspect it wasn't as one-sided as it seemed. But the marriage went downhill fairly rapidly, and in 1960 my mother packed up one afternoon and took my younger half-brother and myself from Melbourne to Sydney on a train to escape." His mother testified at Kocan's trial that he had been rejected by his stepfather and never knew the affection of a father. By that point, Peter Kocan was 14. He was frequently absent from school and soon dropped out. He lost interest in sport and spent most of his time reading. Decades later, Kocan explained, "I'd been wagging it for several months, spending my days wandering around in the museum. I think I just fell through some bureaucratic crack. I was partly living in my imagination and partly just totally untaught in the practical matters of life." He left home and found work at a sheep station in Bathurst. He moved back and forth from Sydney and rural New South Wales, living in sheds and boarding houses and being employed intermittently as a stable hand and a labourer. He struggled financially and was often homeless. Years later, he reflected that he had not been adequately prepared for adulthood, telling the Weekend Australian in 2004, "C.S. Lewis says something about life in general being old birds teaching young birds to fly. None of the old birds ever took the time to show me anything. It was a level of practical unworldliness difficult to understand today. Mine was like the disengagement of some farm boy of 1912 who had hit the big smoke. The jobs got shorter and shorter because I was increasingly unable to cope with the loneliness and degradations." He described the work he did in the bush as akin to medieval serfdom, saying, You were a teenager sent to live in dilapidated tin sheds in a sea of mud. Kocan describes himself as being basically dysfunctional by the time he was 17. His mental health deteriorated, and he became preoccupied with suicide, death, and political assassinations. He wrote a letter to the Australian Nazi Party in which he said he admired Hitler because he had killed himself at the right time and would fantasize about imitating Lee Harvey Oswald, who had assassinated US President John F. Kennedy several years earlier. Thinking of himself as a nobody, he came to believe he could only change that by killing a public figure, hoping to die in notorious circumstances just as Oswald did. By mid-1966, Kocan was living in Sydney once again. He was now working as a factory hand at a dye works and renting a room at a boarding house on Lang Road in the inner-city suburb of Centennial Park. His main form of recreation was watching films, something he spent most of his spare income on. On the 18th of June that year, Kocan read an advertisement in the paper about the anti-war rally that Arthur Calwell would be speaking at in 3 days' time. He resolved then to shoot Calwell. With the last of his money, he purchased a .22 caliber rifle from a shop in Darlinghurst. There was just one problem. It was too big. He told police later, "If I was going to assassinate anyone like Mr. Kennedy from a window, it would have been all right, but it was too bulky to conceal under any clothing." The night before the event, he sawed the barrel and stock off of the weapon, taking care not to be heard through the thin walls of his unit. The blade of his hacksaw was not suited to the task and kept bending and warping as he slowly carved through the gunmetal. Eventually he was done. He spent what he described as a long time posing in front of his dressing table mirror. He said he saw a new self in the mirror, one that seemed suddenly significant. He wanted to photograph himself with the rifle and leave the photo at the scene of his crime, but could not afford a camera. He wrapped the gun in butcher's paper and placed it into an old carry bag along with the bullets. The following evening he travelled to the Mossman Town Hall. He hid the rifle on the grounds of a Methodist church nearby and then went into the hall's lobby to wait for the meeting to finish. Around 10:45 p.m. it concluded. According to those who attended, it was rowdy but otherwise without incident. By this point, Kocan had already retrieved his weapon from the church and had it hidden under his overcoat. When describing what happened next to the police, Kocan said, "I just waited for Mr. Calwell to come out, and he came out and talked to various people, and then he went towards his car talking to other people. He got into his car. Time was running out. I had the gun in my belt under my coat. I drew the gun, walked up to the window and fired in the general direction of the window." Usually, Calwell would keep his car window open, but that night he made the decision to wind it up. This likely saved his life. Seeing Kocan approach, he assumed the young man was a well-wisher and began rolling his window back down. Before he could do so, Kocan aimed at his jugular and fired. The bullet shattered the window but was deflected and broken apart by the impact, landing harmlessly in Calwell's left shirt lapel. He suffered facial wounds from glass and bullet fragments, but was otherwise uninjured. Calwell later testified at Kocan's trial that he had some pain, but not as much as he may have thought. When recounting the incident to his biographer Colm Kiernan, Calwell said, "There was an exploding sound coming from my left, and the glass in the front near-side window shattered, and I felt a stinging sensation to the front of my face in the vicinity of my chin." Kocan assumed he would be cut down in a hail of bullets. Instead, he dropped his weapon and tried to flee the scene, being pursued by a group of onlookers which included the prominent anti-conscription activist Bob Gould. They caught and restrained Kocan, who only offered mild resistance in response. He told police, "I didn't expect to get away, and I did not intend to run, but when it happened I decided to run away as a reflex action." Calwell staggered out of the car with a handkerchief held to his bleeding face, his shirt and tie covered in blood. Labour Senator Doug McClellan, who was also in attendance at the rally, described hearing an explosion that he had assumed was a firecracker and then saw glass shattering from the car window on the footpath. He ran up to Calwell and asked if he was okay. Calwell replied, "I have been shot. I think I'm all right." Calwell went back into the town hall to phone his wife and then was driven to the Royal North Shore Hospital. According to the Canberra Times, Calwell was in agony and near fainting when the ambulance arrived. He was sedated and treated for what the hospital doctors described as severe facial lacerations and was in a stable condition by the morning. Kocan gave a detailed statement to police at 1:45 a.m. that night, explaining, "Unless I did something out of the ordinary, I realized I would remain a nobody all my life. I came to the conclusion that however hard it was, I would have to do something that would set me apart from other nobodies. I would not have done anything so cruel as shoot someone if I had any alternative." He chose Calwell primarily because of the opportunity afforded by the opposition leader's public appearance at a place Kocan could easily travel to, and only decided on him after reading about that appearance in the paper. Kocan said, "I did not intend to shoot Mr. Calwell at first. I wanted to assassinate some public figure. I did not agree with Mr. Calwell's politics, and that made it easier to choose him." He expressed remorse for his actions during the police interview, stating, "I'm sorry I caused pain to Mr. Calwell." Speaking about the event years later, Kocan reflected that the shooting logic was in the air at the time on account of the recent assassinations of public figures like Ngo Dinh Diem, John F. Kennedy, and Malcolm X. By the next morning, the shooting was front-page news across the nation. Prime Minister Holt called it a dreadful incident, telling the press that Australian public life has been singularly free of episodes of violence, and I strongly condemn this gross violation of our democratic traditions. He extended his sympathies to Calwell's wife and said that he hoped Calwell would have a full recovery. That evening, Calwell was released from hospital and returned to his home in Victoria, where he continued to be treated privately by local doctors. 2 days after the shooting, he told reporters, "It could have been quite serious, but it wasn't. I feel all right now." He said that he had forgiven Kocan because he felt the youth must be mentally ill. Kocan was remanded at Long Bay Jail and appeared in court on the 23rd of June, being granted bail of $2,000 on the condition that he report to Paddington Police Station at 6:30 a.m. and 5 p.m. each day. His lawyer, Kevin Murray, told the court that time may well show that the defendant is a person more to be pitied than condemned. His trial began on the 15th of August at the Central Criminal Court in Sydney. Court reporters described him as wearing glasses, grey slacks and a brown shirt, and sitting with his arms folded for most of the hearing. Calwell, Doug McClellan and the police officers who interviewed Kocan were the key witnesses. The consulting government psychiatrist, Dr. Arro Schmalzbach, who examined Kocan on 8 occasions between the 27th of June and the 18th of August, gave evidence that in his professional opinion, Kocan was fit to plead in court, and that he realized the nature and quality of his act. Another psychiatrist, Dr. Sidney Rowe, said that Kocan suffered from a mental illness but was not psychotic, describing him as a borderline schizophrenic. Dr. Rowe told the court that Kocan had a fantasy of ending his own life in notorious circumstances, similar to Lee Harvey Oswald. Kocan's mother testified about her son's childhood, his lack of a father figure, and how he had withdrawn from social activity after his stepfather rejected him. 15 days later, Peter Kocan pled guilty to attempted murder and was sentenced the following day to life imprisonment. Calwell shook hands with Kocan's mother on the courtyard steps prior to the sentence, telling her, "I am sorry." The presiding judge was Sir Leslie Heron, Chief Justice of New South Wales. He described the sentence as a very difficult decision to reach, telling the court, "Public men in Australia must be free to go about their important affairs of state without fear of danger to life or limb. I must see that the law protects them to its utmost." He acknowledged Kocan's previous good character, but said that it was outweighed by the gravity of the offence. Justice Heron recommended that Kocan be offered psychiatric treatment in jail or be detained in a psychiatric institution under the Mental Health Act, and that Kocan should study and learn a trade while incarcerated, eventually being permitted to return to society if his behaviour warranted it. The assassination attempt did not aid Arthur Calwell's political fortunes. While the Vietnam War would become increasingly unpopular in Australia as the conflict wore on, Calwell's determined opposition to the war was presently still at odds with majority Australian opinion. He was considered to have performed poorly during the 1966 election campaign, being outmatched by Prime Minister Harold Holt, who was over a decade younger than the 70-year-old Calwell and a far more effective communicator, especially on the relatively new medium of television. Calwell's anti-war position was undermined further when he and his deputy leader, Gough Whitlam, publicly disagreed on the best path to ending Australia's involvement in Vietnam. In a strange quirk of fate, Prime Minister Holt found himself the target of an apparent assassination attempt of his own several weeks before Election Day. However, the alleged perpetrator, a Yugoslavian named Nedeljko Gadic, only got as far as scoping out Parliament House before being arrested. Calwell lost the November 1966 election to Holt in a historic landslide. He resigned as leader of the Labour Party not long after and was succeeded by Gough Whitlam. Peter Kocan initially served out his sentence at Long Bay Jail in Sydney. One day, while in the exercise yard, a fellow inmate compared the way Kocan had described the clouds above them to the work of the World War I-era poet Rupert Brooke. This was the first Kocan had heard of Brooke. He had his mother send him a collection of Brooke's poetry, which profoundly affected him. Encouraged by a psychiatrist, he sought out further poetry. He was soon transferred to the Morisset Psychiatric Hospital for the criminally insane, spending the remainder of his sentence in what he described as the company of convicts and psychiatric inmates who were profoundly stigmatized and socially marginal by any yardstick. There he studied literature, poetry, and history. In 1967, Kocan began writing poetry of his own. He corresponded with the poet Michael Dransfeld, who would recommend books to Kocan and exchange poetry with him. Early in his incarceration, Kocan wrote what was described as a heartfelt letter of apology to Arthur Calwell. Calwell accepted the apology, writing back, "If there is anything I can do to help you in future in the matter of the mitigation of your sentence, I will do it." He continued corresponding with Kocan and visited him in prison on 3 separate occasions, encouraging him in his rehabilitation. Calwell remained in Parliament for 2 more terms, retiring at the 1972 election that saw Gough Whitlam win office and end 23 years of coalition government. His health deteriorated, and he was eventually hospitalised. On the 8th of July 1973, less than a year after his retirement, Arthur Calwell passed away. He was 76 years old. In time, Peter Kocan's good behaviour saw him transferred out of maximum security and into wards that afforded him more freedom. In his novellas The Treatment and The Cure, he painted what was often a grim picture of the Morisset Psychiatric Hospital, where even those in the less secure wards found themselves at the mercy of violence from guards, unempathetic medical professionals, and the fear of electric shock treatment looming over their heads. He occupied his time working prison jobs and absorbing himself into the craft of writing. Decades later, he said, "Writing became my guiding preoccupation, my source for recognizing the beauty and preciousness of life. It sounds twee, but after the shooting I was this passive field of ashes, and when I started to write it was like shoots of green grass coming up through the ashes." Kocan submitted numerous works of poetry to literary magazines while incarcerated at Morisset, many of which were published. He had 2 poetry collections published near the end of his sentence, Ceremonies for the Lost in 1974 and The Other Side of the Fence in 1975. In 1976, after serving 10 years, he was released on licence. He moved into a cabin at the edge of Tuggerah Lake on the central coast of New South Wales, where he lived for over 20 years. With assistance from government grants, he continued writing. His novella, The Treatment, a semi-fictionalized account of his time at Morisset, was published in 1980, followed by a sequel entitled The Cure in 1983, with the latter book winning the 1983 New South Wales Premier's Literary Award for Fiction. He began teaching and got involved in the local theatre as a director and actor, and published further fiction and poetry collections. His work was often inspired by his life experiences, his incarceration, and his mental health struggles, several winning further literary awards. His 2004 novel Fresh Fields was a fictionalized account of his youth prior to the shooting attempt, while 2010's The Fable of All Our Lives was based on his life after being released from prison. Kocan graduated from the University of Newcastle with a Bachelor of Arts in 1998 and then obtained a master's degree. He moved to Brisbane in 2003, where he still lives today.
He's just been awarded Australia's top writing honour, but 44 years ago, Peter Kocan was locked up in a psychiatric ward for the attempted assassination of Labor's opposition leader Arthur Calwell. Peter Kocan began his career as a writer while he was serving what was to have been a life sentence.
In 2010, Kocan won the Australian Council's prestigious Writers Emeritus Award. In his acceptance speech, he spoke of the assassination attempt.
If I look at my own life story to this point, especially given, shall we say, the misadventures of the earlier part of it, I think the lesson is clear that no matter how badly you've messed up or how deep the hole you've fallen into, it isn't necessarily the end.